Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning. I guess most of the audience are from academia, so I'll introduce myself from industry in a slightly more, different way. To start with a confession, I'm not a researcher by any means. So my insights or perspectives will be from industry. And in my experience of working in a corporate dealing with research institutes and now in a startup, trying to deal with research institutes, both in academia and industry. So since the first session, I thought I will offer some entertainment value to start with and then share my perspectives. I happened to be at a research seminar on a very different topic a week ago in Bangalore. It has nothing to do with my domain. It is about influence of Chalukyan architecture on Deccan heritage or Deccan monuments in India. Incidentally presented by a researcher and a scholar from US. There are 100 people in the meeting and 40 of them are non-Indians. And the remaining are senior citizens. And there are 10 or so research scholars, I would guess, in the area of history, archaeology, and art. The session took 1 hour and there was one question from a research scholar. I thought it's quite an insight to listen to the answer given for the question asked. The question asked by the lady, I guess she's a research scholar, because it takes a long time to figure out patterns in architecture, especially the columns in the temples and its roots in Persian or in Hindu philosophy. She asked, how does one go about it? Did the professor spend time in looking at every rock, every monument, stone? It's a very large region in Deccan Plateau, right? It's almost the whole of South India. And how much time it took? I guess the question is, she's trying to figure out, how much time does it take to do such kind of work? I thought I knew the answer because I know many researchers and many PhDs in my family. So I thought, okay, it will say about 4-5 years, I thought. He said it takes some familiarity before you discover any pattern. And then you can do some research and figure out some, insights or info something. The familiarity took about 20 years. And the 10 years. There was absolute silence in the room, which actually amounted to 30 years. So he said, I spent 35 years in this region in looking at every rock, every monument. Before I found any pattern, it took me a long time. I hope the IT research is not that long, but maybe it is a balance between what you call wisdom and knowledge. So let me start with analytics with a headline view. I want to make 2 provocative statements before I start the startup side of collaborations. I think the headline view, I want to make maybe 3 statements. The first one is the disaggregation of stack in analytics. For those people who involved in analytics before, right from the spreadsheet models to the current big data models, the stack got disaggregated. Now, innovate and research perhaps in each of the areas, whether it is in data sets, whether it is algorithmic layers, whether it is in business logic or computational, whether it is in visualization, interaction design to use a more fashionable term, or in case of business impact, which is what MBAs do. The second one is the mix of 3 data sets, which in my view, I put it slightly differently. You have the enterprise data, which is generally structured, machine data, which is basically ad hoc, and then maybe you have social data, which you are trying to mix. And you find most startups in big data space either meddling with one of them or at least more than one of them. But on the people side, or on the research side, or even on the engineering side, and I want to use the term very incisively that to differentiate between engineering and research, I would think that it is an overloading of skills, but underrepresentation of knowledge. And this is one thing which you find both in large corporates and in startups. Perhaps it is a provocative statement to make that we stop distinguishing between skills and knowledge. But let me also give a landscape view and not the headline view like this on how I see the space and the role for research and the segments in which startups normally work. It's also a convergence of many domains. As I was speaking in another panel discussion of ACM maybe a month ago, I don't know whether analytics is a science. Is it an engineering discipline? Is it art? Is it just business? I think we mixed a lot of domains today in the current area of analytics. I would also say that it's an integration, to put it more philosophically, of what you think, what you feel, and what you do. To put it more rigorously, it's an integration of sensorial, semantic, and perhaps structural, which is maybe behavioral data. So let me now, with that context, explain how a startup looks at it, and I give two examples just to take you through the experience I've been through in the recent, I would say 5 years. I skipped my corporate experience and just focus on the startup side. The two examples I want to give are one from my own company and what we did in the initial 6 months, which is about 3 years ago. And second, about an example which is currently hot or active. We're still not done with it. I'm a mentor and investor in that company. The first one is about Crayon Data. This is my firm in Singapore with a center in Chennai. I work out of Bangalore, but it's in the science of choice. So I will maybe explain about my experience of trying to solve one dimension of it, which is called trust modeling in social data. And give an example of the other startup where I'm an investor and mentor in image analytics, just to drive home the point on where I find the research challenge or collaboration from a startup perspective. Just to complete the story, I also lead the task force on startup process under Startup India. So I'm very familiar with venture capital and the funding processes and what is the gap and why some things are done differently in a startup. So that's the perspective I come from. So let me just give a view or the life stage view of the first example. In science of choice, the startup was established in 2012 by 3 of us. I come from engineering and IT background. My co-founder comes from digital media. And the other person comes from analytics. Prior to that, in advertising. He sold his earlier firm to IBM. But I'm the only person who is tech. So these are 3 people. And we initially started modeling how choices are made. So this is the science of choice or choice theory. Recommended systems, if you want to use an academic categorization. The theoretical foundation is based on The Art of Choosing of Sheena Iyengar's book or The Paradox of Choice of Barry Schwartz. However, when we want to look at choice in a little more scientific way, there are enough papers in MIT and other things which are published. We looked at a few dimensions, and I will talk about one dimension in detail. We said that choice is generally made by a combination of taste, behavior, which is about what you act, context, the context of your behavior, influence, which is social influence for all practical purposes, and trust. These were our initial dimensions when we want to look at how choices are built. So I hired a dual PhD, one in computational linguistics and second differential geometry, paired him up with a lady from Stanford. So you can pick all the data science covered, and we have enough people who have done on big data and IT startups. So we're trying to, this is the initial 6 months, yeah? So we're trying to model how to use this. So it's easy to look at context, because for most practical purposes, and we were looking at a retail example at the time, which was proved to be wrong later. We looked at context, essentially location, for example, or your geospatial data. And the behavior is about transaction, which you come from enterprise data. Influence typically is about social data, influence or peer network. And then you have taste, which is about your product to product or item to item affinity, which we compute. We added trust because we thought that's the dimension which we should model. So we spent a lot of time in trying to model trust in online. And I'll give a reason why we picked that. At that time, this is in the first 6 months of a startup, just remember that. We were thinking, or rather we made an assumption, I would say, that our best customer fit will be in a retail space or especially online retail. In online retail, for those people who are from industry, and some of you work in this space will know, it diverges from the physical or what you call brick and mortar space. In the sense, in brick and mortar, transactions lead to trust. In online, trust leads to transaction. It is exactly the other way. And hence, because we thought we should focus on retail segment, we should model trust. So we looked at the academic papers, we looked at the mathematical models, etc. So the question, since you are mostly from academia, you can perhaps characterize it as, should a triadic closure work in trust? In case of social influence or reviews, it works, right? A likes B, B likes C, you can do the triadic closure ABC. So the question that is asked is, can you use a directed acyclic graph or a triadic closure in trust network? So I trust a person and he trusts somebody else. Can I say that I can trust the third person? Does trust propagate in the same way? So we felt, after researching for some time, the question seemed to be more about behavioral and cognitive science than computer science. And second, we found that maybe there is a subcultural variation. It depends on what the data set is. A North American data set behaves very differently from an Indian or a Southeast Asian data set. We really don't know. A crude example, but a hard-hitting example, you trust your mother, but do you trust a recommendation to buy a stock? Not necessarily. Your stockbroker has an influence on the stock you pick. Do you trust him or her? Maybe it doesn't propagate in that sense. So we thought, after doing about 4-5 months, we really don't know whether we are solving the problem. And imagine this is one of the dimensions of the overall model. The second problem is the data set. So what is the signal for trust, especially online trust? This trust of individuals and not trust in a data space or nodes. So the closest we could come to is somebody sharing photographs or intimate photographs is one of the indicators of high amount of trust. Then I spoke to somebody who's a PhD in social sciences from TIS. He said, well, I don't know whether you can say that. Because sometimes you actually upload your intimate photographs to anonymous users rather than people who know. So you can really say definitively that trust means sharing your photographs, but in general, that is an indicator, a strong indicator. At the end of the day, we are trying to model someone's behavior or how you think. So then he explained to me that you should understand the difference between cognitive science and behavioral science. How you think may be different from how you act. You can't just correlate so easily without looking at the subcultural and belief variations. Imagine in a startup, I cannot be spending time in figuring out behavioral science, cognitive science, human behavior, subcultural variations, etc. So we felt, okay, let me see, given our other data sets we have and the other factors we have, what is the amount of business effect we have if actually do it? And we did try this model. And we found that it doesn't really act to us at the time. And we also realized in 6 to 8 months time frame that the online retail to be specific, is not necessarily our lead customer. And we at that time thought that the banks will be the the least interesting for us, and that happened to be the most interesting. So my experiments with a mathematician, a computer scientist, in trying to figure out, I was wondering, should I have used an external or a research collaboration in that sense to cut down this time? I found that very few were willing to talk, because most of the time when we approached any academic institute, even a business institute who do consumer psychology, the problem has to be defined in a very precise way or a very narrow fashion rather than such a broad fashion. The second issue I had was the data set. We were interested in a very large amount of data points and not about 10,000 people and 5,000 people, which is normally a campus kind of a solution. So we actually dropped modeling trust in the first 6 months. Now, it's almost 3.5 years. So far, we never found a reason to go back, though I still keep a tab on it. It's only later when I was speaking at Myntra, and I was explaining the same problem, that the trust propagates differently online compared to physical world. But we still find that it's a very niche problem to solve for most of the business issues you see. So as a startup, since I don't have too much of time and too much of money, you have to make those choices very early. So one of the first things I learned is that you need a kind of a rigorous analysis in the first 6 months of a startup phase. But then it'll go back later to solve a problem at scale, and we suspend most of the research collaboration in between because most startups would like to patent and not publish. That's the case with Crayon Data as well. So we decided to actually hire people with those backgrounds into the company rather than collaborate with anybody else. Now coming to the next point, which is on the image side, which is an interesting argument again. On the image side, I'll give an example again in retail, which is easier to connect instead of giving an IoT example. In a text analytics, I will try to figure out what you meant by seeing what you said, or what you stated, or what you wrote. In image analytics, I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to buy or similarity measure. So if I see a shirt, I know that you are liking black shirts, so you like maybe formal shirts, some conclusion like that. But in object of interest, you will find, especially from academia, you will know, it is very difficult to find or infer something like that if you wear a brown shirt. What is the object? It's not so easy to figure out. It matches your skin, so I have to look at the texture, I have to look at a lot of other things. It's very easy if it is a blue shirt because skin is not blue. Now, there is enough research in this. Incidentally, this is one of the top startup areas in retail. Then we went to look at, this is a startup I invested and mentor them, is to look at some of the unsupervised learning systems, right, or learning techniques, especially CNNs, neural networks. And since I have gone through the experience of first 6 months in the other startup, I told this person that I think we should try it again, whether we can deal with academia or industry research institutes to see what's the state of art. So we found many things. We found the packages, we found the methods. We also know the people who actually research in that area. But one of the biggest challenges, even today, it's a live case, that the problem definition may not be same as what an academic researcher or domain wants versus an industry use. Second, we found that most of the GitHub or whatever packages they upload, they're not at a level of industry quality. They rarely work at scale. So this is one of the biggest challenges. At the end of the day, we can't be testing 10 packages just to figure out what works. Then comes dealing with the people who are experts. Unfortunately, in Indian ecosystem, this may be a little exotic, but, well, the question is whether is it a collaboration in a commercial sense or is just a research interest, right? So as you can figure out in many of the collaborations we found, with the exception of startups coming from institutes, where the professor normally has an equity component in the company, any company which is starting outside of the campus, having an equity deal with a professor is not very common in India. It's also not very common actually outside, for the simple reason that the the trust that way is not very high because most of them would like to patent many of these methods. However, we found that the state of art doesn't really fit in to some of the models. And this is the same debate we used to have internally. And this is the case with many big data analytics companies, especially in data science, that should I take a mathematician? Should I work with a theoretical computer science person? Or should I take a person who is more active on, say, a big data stack, who can, of course, a good big data programmer can he not solve or she not solve? We found that most of the areas here, they club statistics or stochastic models, graph models, and the big data computational complexities. Now, this is a very rare combination, actually. From an academic perspective, it will cut into different departments, right? To make it more provocative, most professors who come from that background cannot actually code on a big data environment. I don't want a spreadsheet model, right? We can't work with such models. And in a big data, I cannot just work with a manual one and then try to make it big. Yeah. The second one we found is that statisticians do not know graph theory. And most of them, especially the affinity models, are built on graph theory or network models, let me say. In image processing, it is also to do with some of the signal processing and other subjects, which may not cut with many of the classical mathematician domain. And we found a combination of a theoretical computer science seems to work, but then many of them want almost a computer science problem rather than an engineering problem. So I think if you find most of the groups like us, we are Series B funded, so we are not really small. So we actually take a mix of these people because there is no way we can solve it by just having a single dimensional expertise. Now, what is it that we can, so the question that is often asked in a mentorship network is, when should I engage? In my studied opinion, I mean, it's open for debate. I think it's good to check the first 6 months, which makes a lot of sense. However, it is based on the intimacy with the promoter and the professor or the institution. Whereas I actually found more use if it is after 18 months in a startup journey, where you already have your solution working in a customer place. We have the data sets, we have things working sometime, but it has to be more robust, more rigorous, more scalable, and perhaps to pivot into a different model. Just to give you a contrast, this particular model believes that the triangle of academia, product, and the team, it comes in that triangle. If I talk to a business school, it works exactly the other way. We do deal with some of the retail experts, for example, or banking experts, and coming from the academia. But because they have a customer connect and they have that data, it seems to work exactly the opposite way. So I think it's an interesting debate to have academia. I don't want to make it only computer science or mathematics, but it's also the business schools. So we find that when you collaborate with, whether it is Harvard or Columbia School or Stanford, it seems to work in a different way. Maybe they're coming on the business side more than the product side, and hence the arguments and collaborations and insights differ. So I think with that, I want to pause here and maybe take the remaining questions at the panel. Thank you.
So if we have maybe 1 or 2 quick questions, we can take them now and then defer the rest for the panel. Any questions? Go ahead.
How much do you think is the historical significance and origin of the data has significance in the your trust model?
Maybe I cannot answer it for a specific dimension like trust, but I can give you an answer for the overall dimensions. Typically, we look for 2 years. The last 2 years data, because the one of the issues we found is, of course, because it is also a social data and enterprise data integration, we want it to be a little more fresh. But most of these models, they are built on a Markov model, right? So a few data points won't make a difference, but we need at least a temporal dimension of 2 to 2.5 years. So when we deal with, for example, banking sector, which is our biggest sector we deal with, we ask for 2 years transaction data. And the social data in the similar way, but it's okay if you differ here and there. But normally we don't go back more than 2 years.
At the back.
Sir, you said you want researchers who are an expert in graph theory, I mean, mixed people. Are you able to find those type of people?
We can't find them in one individual, but okay, let me give my experience of recruiting both in India and in Singapore. And I've done one recruitment in US. In fact, my data scientist is in Bay Area, is a Russian mathematician. But graph theory from a number perspective, from volume of people perspective, generally seems to associate itself with networks rather than mathematics as such, right? So if I take people who have worked a lot in communication networks, especially if you work in the lower end of the networks, like optical or metro, which is topology driven, right? Your fairness algorithms, your topology discovery, they're all coming from essentially graph theory. So actually those people they don't need much of they're quite warm in terms of skill sets. They may have a problem in solving it in a database context. So I'm using a graph database, rather I'm using a graph processing, but not graph database. So we have an issue with some of the people who come from the comm industry perspective. They have a problem with the data models and how it works. But graph theory in general, they don't need understand. I mean, they understand topology. I mean, those things I understand. Especially if you're in the mesh networks, anything topology at the network layer, they will generally know. It is a different argument that for large corporates, I mean, I'm sorry to make a comment on large corporates, I'll be surprised if they know what it means. Because nobody works in a large corporate on topology discovery if you're in a services firm. You don't make much money in it.
Great, thank you again.